Dear listeners, welcome to Tales of Time. Thank you for joining us in this space where stories of love, redemption, and hope come alive through the forgotten pages of American history. Today we'll travel back to the 1850s, where a man marked by grief and a young woman abandoned by fate will meet on the most unexpected night of their lives. What happened that Christmas Eve would forever change the course of their existence, proving that even in the darkest hours, hope can flourish. If you appreciate stories of love and transformation set in historical America, don't forget to subscribe to Tales of Time. We publish new stories every day. Leave your like if this narrative touches your heart and share in the comments where you're listening from and what your favorite time is to hear our stories. Thunder rolled across the Appalachian foothills with force enough to rattle the windows of the manor house. Colonel Augustus Wakefield adjusted his leather hat over his head as he watched from the covered porch, dark clouds gathering over the Blue Ridge Mountains. The R+99 hadn't started yet, but the heavy, electrified air announced the approaching storm. It was Christmas Eve, 1855, and the elements seemed to conspire to make the date even more oppressive for that solitary man. Augustus was 45 years old, though the deep lines around his dark brown eyes and the silver streaks that now dominated his temples made him look older. Tall with broad shoulders, molded by years of working the land, he still maintained the proud bearing that had earned him the rank of colonel in the Virginia militia, but there was something in his gaze, an ancient sadness that had settled there and never left, that revealed the invisible wounds he carried. It had been 4 years, 4 exact years, since yellow fever had arrived in the valley like a divine plague, reaping lives without distinction of class or fortune. The epidemic had taken his wife, Elizabeth, a woman of rare beauty and kindness who had governed Wakefield Manor with a firm hand but tender heart. And as if it weren't enough to steal his companion, the cursed disease had also claimed his son, Peter Augustus, a boy of only 7 years whose laughter still echoed through the empty corridors of the main house. Wakefield Manor stretched across leagues of fertile land on the gentle slopes of the valley. It was one of the most prosperous properties in the region, with its tobacco fields climbing the hills and endless rows of dark green plants bearing their precious leaves at that time of year. The main house, built in the colonial style with brick walls and slate roof, rose imposingly atop an elevation, surrounded by gardens that Elizabeth had planted with her own hands. There was the great porch with its stone arches, the main hall with crystal chandeliers brought from England, the private chapel where 3 generations of Wakefields had been baptized, married, and mourned. But all that grandeur seemed empty without the people who had filled it with life. Augustus could barely stand to enter the chapel since the funerals. He avoided the room that had been Peter Augustus's, kept intact by Aunt Bethy, like a silent shrine to the boy's memory. And each Christmas, the pain renewed itself with brutal force, because it had been precisely on Christmas 1851 that Elizabeth had fallen ill, succumbing to the fever days later, followed by their son who had tried in vain to save her with his childish prayers. Aunt Bethy, a freedwoman whom Elizabeth had emancipated 10 years before the tragedy but who had chosen to remain at the manor as housekeeper, approached along the porch with her silent steps. She was a woman with skin dark as ebony, hair already completely white pulled into a tight bun, and eyes that had seen more suffering than most could bear. She was nearly 70 years old but still moved with surprising agility. "Colonel Wakefield," she said in a voice roughened by time, using the treatment she maintained out of decades of habit. "Caleb is saying you shouldn't go out with this storm coming. The workers from the quarters are all gathered in. The livestock is in the low pasture. There's nothing that can't wait until tomorrow." Augustus continued looking at the clouds, hands clasped behind his back. "I need to check the tobacco fields in the north sector. With heavy rain, there could be flooding on that slope. We lost £2,000 in the last storm through carelessness." "You know it's not the tobacco you're running from," Aunt Bethy responded with the frankness that only decades of acquaintance permitted. "It's the house, the memories, Christmas. But running won't bring them back and might end up leaving us without you too." Augustus closed his eyes for a moment. The old housekeeper was right, as always. Every Christmas Eve was the same for the past 4 years. He would invent some urgency on the plantation, any excuse to escape the modest festivities that Aunt Bethy insisted on maintaining for the workers. She would decorate the main hall with pine branches and wildflowers, organize a simple supper, distribute small gifts to the children of the tenant farmers who worked the land. Augustus permitted everything, even financed it generously, but never participated. "I'll take Thunder," he said, referring to his favorite Morgan horse, a black animal with a white star on its forehead. "I'll be back before it gets completely dark." Before Aunt Bethy could protest again, Caleb appeared coming from the stables. The overseer was 50 years old, a free man born to enslaved parents whom Augustus had freed, and he knew every inch of the plantation as well as the owner himself. He had bronze skin burned by the sun, hands calloused from so much work, and a loyalty to Augustus that bordered on devotion. "Colonel," he said, removing his straw hat. "It's not wise. This storm is coming strong. I can see it by the lightning. The rivers will swell fast and that old bridge over Willow Creek is already weak. Then I'll go by the high road, skirting the creek," Augustus responded with the stubbornness that characterized him. "Caleb, you stay responsible for ensuring everyone has a decent supper. Aunt Bethy has already prepared everything." The overseer and the housekeeper exchanged resigned looks. They knew this man too well to know that when he made a decision, it was useless to argue. Augustus descended the stone steps of the porch and headed to the stables. The ample building with high ceiling and spacious stalls housed a dozen work and riding horses. Thunder whinnied upon seeing him approach, as if sensing the ride that lay ahead. The animal was strong, resistant, trained for difficult terrain. While saddling the horse, Augustus allowed his mind to wander down the dangerous paths of memory. He remembered Elizabeth, her crystalline laugh echoing through the main house. She was the daughter of a tobacco baron from Richmond, raised amid luxuries, but possessed a generous heart that made her beloved by all on the plantation. It had been she who convinced Augustus to free several enslaved people, arguing that free men worked with more dedication. It had been she who established the rudimentary school for the workers' children, where a teacher from Richmond taught the first letters. And Peter Augustus, his son. The boy loved to ride alongside his father, insisting on accompanying him on plantation inspections even when his little legs barely reached the stirrups. He had his mother's black hair and his father's brown eyes and a smile that illuminated the darkest days. When the fever took him, Augustus felt as if a part of his own soul had been torn away. He shook his head violently, pushing away the memories. There was no point in stirring up the past. The dead didn't return, no matter how much you wept for them. He mounted Thunder and departed toward the northern tobacco fields. The sky was darkening rapidly, not only from the approaching storm but also from the falling afternoon. It was almost 4 o'clock and in the southern winter the sun set early, especially with dense clouds blocking the light. The path wound between the tobacco fields, climbing gently up the slope. Augustus knew every curve, every tree, every stone of that route. Wakefield Manor had been founded by his grandfather at the beginning of the century, when tobacco was still the dominant crop in Virginia. His father had expanded the plantations and Augustus had tripled them, becoming one of the largest producers in the region. But all that material success seemed like ash in his mouth. What good was fortune if there was no one to share it with? He had no other children, no living siblings. His parents had passed away more than a decade ago. Distant cousins occasionally appeared with veiled suggestions of marriage, introducing him to respectable widows or marriageable young ladies from traditional families. Augustus refused them all with a firm courtesy that left no margin for insistence. How could he think of replacing Elizabeth? The idea seemed to him a betrayal of her memory, a profanation of the love they had shared for 15 years of marriage. The first drops of rain began to fall when Augustus reached the northern sector of the tobacco fields. They were thick, heavy drops announcing the deluge that would come. He quickly examined the slope that worried him. The earth seemed firm, the tobacco plants well rooted. There would be no landslide, at least not there. Thunder roared again, closer this time. A lightning bolt tore through the sky, illuminating the landscape with ghostly clarity for a brief instant. It was in that moment, in that flash of light, that Augustus saw something that made him frown. Beyond the fence that marked the northern boundary of his property, there was an old building he knew well. It was the old mill house, remnant from the times when those lands produced grain before tobacco dominated the valley. The structure had been in ruins for decades, with the roof collapsed and stone walls covered by vines. No one went there, except occasionally some hunter looking for deer or turkey. But Augustus was certain he had seen a light, a small orange glow, like from a fire or lantern, flickering through one of the glassless windows of the ruined building. His first reaction was irritation. Probably some wanderer seeking shelter from the storm. It wasn't uncommon for travelers to get lost on the valley roads, especially in bad weather. The correct thing would be to leave them alone or at most send Caleb the next day to check. But something bothered him. That building was dangerous, with rotten beams that could collapse at any moment. And there were snakes, many snakes that made nests in the warm stones. If someone was in there without knowing the dangers. Augustus made a decision. It wouldn't hurt to check. He guided Thunder toward the fence, finding a gate that was rarely used. The rain was falling harder now, soaking his clothes, but he barely noticed. As he approached the mill house, his senses sharpened. There was definitely a light inside, weaker now, as if the fire were dying. And there were sounds. Moans. No, they weren't common moans of pain. They were muffled screams, interspersed with tense silences. Augustus's heart accelerated. He dismounted quickly, tying Thunder to a nearby tree. The rain was falling torrentially now, turning the ground to mud. Successive lightning bolts illuminated the premature night. Augustus advanced to the entrance of the mill house, an opening without a door where the wood had rotted years ago. What he saw upon entering left him completely paralyzed. On the irregular stone floor, atop a pile of dry leaves and branches, lay a young woman. She couldn't be more than 18 or 19 years old. Her simple dress of cheap, already worn cotton was torn and dirty. Her light brown hair, which must have been long and wavy, was tangled and stuck to her pale face with sweat. Her eyes, when they fixed on Augustus, were an impressive honey brown, but at that moment they conveyed only terror and agony. She was pregnant, very pregnant. And from her screams and the position in which she writhed, she was in full labor. Beside her, on a flat stone, burned a small fire made with twigs and dry leaves that the rain entering through the cracks was beginning to extinguish. It was the only source of light and heat in that desolate place. There were no blankets, no clean water, absolutely nothing that could help a woman give birth. For the love of God, Augustus murmured, his voice hoarse with shock. The young woman tried to pull back, drag herself away, but another spasm of pain doubled her over. She screamed, a primitive and terrifying sound that echoed through the stone walls of the ruin. Her hands clawed at the ground, nails digging into the earth, her entire body trembling with the force of contractions. Augustus reacted by instinct. He ran to her, kneeling in the mud and wet leaves. Miss, listen to me. I'm Colonel Augustus Wakefield, owner of these lands. I won't hurt you. You need to tell me how long you've been like this." She stared at him with eyes glazed by pain and fear. She tried to speak but could only moan. Then, with visible effort, she whispered, since early this morning." Augustus felt his stomach tighten. If she had been in labor since morning, more than 12 hours had passed. 12 hours alone, without help, in that terrible place. He looked around desperately, military training struggling to overcome panic. He had to get her to the manor. Aunt Bethy knew herbs, had experience as a midwife. She had already helped bring several children into the world, both in the quarters and among the tenant farmers. But the manor was at least half an hour's ride away, and that under normal conditions. With the storm, the path would be treacherous. And by the young woman's appearance, by the way she writhed, the baby was coming now. There was no time. "What's your name?" he asked, trying to keep her conscious, trying to establish some connection. "Ma Mary," she managed to answer through clenched teeth. And then she screamed again, arching her back, her entire body tense with contraction. "Mary, listen to me carefully," Augustus said with a firmness he didn't feel. "I'm going to take you to my house, but first I need to see if the baby is coming. May I?" She nodded weakly, tears streaming mixed with sweat. Augustus pushed aside the torn fabric of the dress with trembling hands. He wasn't a doctor, wasn't a midwife, but he'd grown up on a plantation. He'd witnessed births of foals and calves. He knew the principles were similar, though the idea of comparing them made him feel deeply uncomfortable. What he saw confirmed his worst fears. The child was crowning. The head was already beginning to emerge. There was no time, no choice. "The baby is coming, Mary. It's coming now," he said, his voice firm despite the panic he felt. "When the next pain comes, you're going to push with all the strength you have, understand?" She only moaned, but Augustus interpreted it as assent. He quickly removed his soaked coat and spread it on the ground. It wasn't much, but it was something. He also removed his shirt, tearing it to have minimally clean cloths. The contraction came like a violent wave. Mary screamed and pushed, her face contorted by superhuman effort. Augustus held the small head that emerged, feeling completely helpless and terrified. All his courage in battles, all his command over men and business, none of it had prepared him for this moment. Again, he ordered when another contraction shook the young woman's body. "Push." Mary obeyed, roaring with pain and effort. And then, in a moment Augustus would never forget, the child slipped into his hands. It was a tiny girl, covered in vernix and blood, but perfect. And silent. Terribly silent. Panic stabbed at Augustus's chest. The girl wasn't crying, wasn't moving. He remembered Peter Augustus, the son who was born crying strongly but died years later, silenced by fever. No, he couldn't let another child die. He acted by instinct. He cleaned the tiny mouth with a piece of his shirt, turned the girl face down over his hand and gave firm pats on her back. Once, twice, 3 times. And then, like a miracle, the girl coughed and then let out a thin but indignant cry, the most beautiful music Augustus had ever heard. Mary, exhausted beyond any description, began to cry too. Tears of relief streamed down her face as she extended trembling arms. Augustus wrapped the girl in part of his torn shirt and placed her in her mother's arms. "A girl," he said, his voice choked with emotion he couldn't name. "You have a daughter." Mary hugged the child to her chest, sobbing. The girl continued crying, tiny fists waving in the air. She was alive. Both were alive. But Augustus knew they weren't safe yet. The placenta still needed to come out. Mary had lost a lot of blood and both were exposed to cold and humidity on a stormy night. He had to get them to the manor. He had to do it now. "Mary," he said firmly. "I need to cut the cord and then we're going to my house. There's a woman there who will take care of both of you. Hold on a little longer. Just a little longer." Using the knife he always carried on his belt, Augustus tied the umbilical cord with strips torn from his shirt and cut it. It wasn't the ideal method, but it was what he had. Then he waited while Mary, with gentler contractions now, expelled the placenta. When it was finally done, Augustus acted with military speed. He picked up the young woman in his arms, she still holding her daughter firmly against her chest. Mary was light, dangerously light, as if she'd gone days without eating properly. The child was an almost imperceptible weight. "Hang on," he said, though he wasn't sure if he was talking to her or himself. "We're going now." The rain fell mercilessly when Augustus exited the mill house carrying Mary and the newborn. Thunder waited patiently tied to the tree, ears flat with the discomfort of the storm. Augustus untied the reins with one hand, keeping Mary secure with the other arm. Mounting would be a challenge. Normally he would have placed the young woman in the saddle and mounted behind, but she was too weak to hold on and had a child in her arms. He would have to hold her against his chest while controlling the horse. With considerable effort, Augustus managed to mount, pulling Mary so she sat sideways in his lap, leaning against his chest. She moaned softly with pain at each movement but kept her daughter firmly embraced. The girl had stopped crying, exhausted, and Augustus prayed silently that it wasn't a sign of something wrong. "It'll be all right," he murmured, more to himself than to her. "Half an hour and we'll be home." Thunder departed amid the storm. Lightning illuminated the path at erratic intervals, showing a transformed world. The ground was a muddy mess. The streams had become furious torrents. Augustus knew every inch of that territory, but under violent rain and premature darkness, even the familiar seemed strange and threatening. Mary trembled against his chest. He pulled her closer, trying to protect her and the child with his own body. She whispered something he couldn't understand over the noise of the rain. "What?" he asked, leaning his head down. "Thank you," she repeated, her voice weak but clear. "Thank you for not letting us die." Augustus felt something tighten in his chest. For years ago, he had prayed for God to save his wife and son. His prayers weren't answered. Tonight, without having planned it, without having asked for it, he had saved 2 lives. He didn't know what it meant. He didn't know if it meant anything. But as he rode through the storm, holding that mother and that child against death, Augustus Wakefield felt, for the first time in 4 long years, something beyond the pain that had become his constant companion. He felt purpose. The lights of Wakefield Manor appeared through the curtain of rain like beacons of hope. Augustus shouted with all the strength he possessed, "Aunt Bethy! Caleb! Open the doors!" And as figures ran across the manor's porch, as alarmed voices mixed with the roar of the storm, Augustus held tighter that young mother and her newborn daughter. On that Christmas night of 1855, something had changed. He still didn't fully understand what or why, but it had changed. And there was no going back. The main door of the manor burst open before Augustus even dismounted. Aunt Bethy appeared in the doorway, holding a lantern high, her eyes wide as she perceived the scene before her. "Holy Mother of God," exclaimed the housekeeper, quickly descending the stone steps despite her age. "What happened, Colonel Augustus?" "A young woman," Augustus responded, his voice tense from the effort of controlling thunder with one hand while holding Mary with the other. "I found her in the old mill house. She was giving birth alone. I need help now." Caleb didn't wait for more explanations. He ran to the horse and extended his arms to receive Mary. Augustus passed her carefully to the overseer, who held her with surprising gentleness for a man of his proportions. The young woman moaned softly but kept her daughter firmly embraced against her chest. "Take her inside quickly," ordered Aunt Bethy, already turning to climb the stairs. "To the guest room on the 2nd floor, the one with the large fireplace." Augustus dismounted quickly, his legs almost giving out when they touched the ground. The ride. Through the storm, the birth, the tension of the last moments, everything was taking its toll now. But there was no time for weakness. He ran up behind Caleb, who was already carrying Mary up the internal stairs. The manor's main house had 2 floors, with the ground floor housing the main halls, dining room, library, and offices, while the upper floor was dedicated to bedrooms. The room to which Aunt Bethy directed them was in the east wing, a spacious chamber with a canopy bed of noble wood, carved wardrobes, and a stone fireplace that already crackled with dry wood. 2 household servants, Josephine and Ruth, had already been called and waited with basins of hot water, clean cloths, and white sheets. Their expressions showed curiosity and concern in equal parts. "Place her on the bed," instructed Aunt Bethy, assuming command with the authority of someone who'd spent decades caring for that house. "Carefully, Caleb. Ruth, bring more lanterns. Josephine, go get my herb chest from the pantry. And you, Colonel Augustus, go change those soaked clothes before you catch pneumonia." But Augustus didn't move. He stood by the door, watching as Caleb deposited Mary onto the soft mattress. The young woman let out a sigh of relief upon feeling the softness beneath her, after hours on stones and earth. She still held her daughter, who had begun crying again with a weak little voice. Aunt Betty approached the bed, her movements quick but gentle. "Let me see this child, daughter," she said with a soft voice. Mary hesitated for a moment, her eyes scanning the unfamiliar faces around her. When her gaze met Augustus's by the door, he nodded slightly, a reassuring gesture. With trembling fingers, Mary allowed the housekeeper to take the newborn. Aunt Betty examined the girl with experienced eyes, checking breathing, skin color, the tiny limbs. The child cried harder now, which drew a smile from the old midwife. "Strong cry is a good sign," she said. "Means the little lungs are working well. But she's cold. We need to warm her up." She turned to Ruth, who had just returned with more lanterns. "Get that wool shawl from my room and bring it. And have someone warm goat's milk, not too hot, just warm." While Ruth ran off, Aunt Betty began cleaning the girl with warm water and soft cloths. Augustus watched, fascinated despite himself. The child was so small, so fragile. Her fists opened and closed, her little legs kicked. She had a tuft of dark hair, still damp, and when she briefly opened her eyes, Augustus saw they were a deep blue, though he knew the color would change with time. "The cord?" asked Aunt Betty, looking at Augustus. "I tied and cut it," he responded, "with strips from my shirt and my knife. It was the best I could do under those conditions." The housekeeper examined the work and nodded approvingly. "You did well, sir. You saved this girl's life and her mother's." She took a dark substance from a small jar that Josephine had just brought. It was an ointment made with herbs that helped prevent infections. She applied it carefully to the baby's umbilical cord. Mary watched everything from the bed, her eyes half closed with exhaustion. She trembled violently, whether from cold, shock, or both. Josephine approached her with a cup of hot broth. "Drink, miss," said the servant gently. "It'll do you good." But Mary's hands trembled so much she could barely hold the cup. Aunt Betty noticed and signaled to Josephine, who gently helped the young woman drink the broth in sips. The hot liquid brought some color back to Mary's pale cheeks. "Now the placenta came out whole?" asked Aunt Betty, always practical. "It did," confirmed Augustus, "they're at the mill house before I brought her." "Good. Now I need to examine her properly, see if there are no tears that need caring for." The housekeeper turned to Augustus with a firm expression. "And you really need to leave here and change. You're dripping on Mrs. Elizabeth's carpet and you'll still get sick." The mention of Elizabeth made Augustus blink as if waking from a trance. He looked down and realized he was indeed soaked, a puddle forming at his feet. He nodded slowly. "Caleb, stay here in case Aunt Betty needs anything," he said. "I'll change and come back." The overseer nodded yes, positioning himself discreetly by the door, respectful but vigilant. Augustus left the room and walked down the corridor to his own chambers. They were the same ones he'd shared with Elizabeth for 15 years. After her death, he'd thought about moving to another room but never had, perhaps out of masochism, perhaps out of fear that changing it would mean forgetting. He closed the door behind him and began removing the soaked clothes. His hands trembled slightly, the shock of what had just happened finally reaching him. In less than 2 hours, his solitary and predictable routine had been completely shattered. While dressing in dry clothes, his eyes wandered around the room. The bed where Elizabeth had slept, the vanity where she brushed her long black hair, the prayer nook on the wall where she prayed every night. Everything kept exactly as she'd left it. But something was different tonight. For the first time in 4 years, those objects didn't seem to accuse him of continuing to live while she had died. On the contrary, it was as if Elizabeth were there, whispering in his ear that he'd done the right thing. He shook his head. He was tired. That was all. His body and mind playing tricks. When he returned to the guest room, he found a transformed scene. Mary now wore a clean nightgown, Augustus recognized it as one that had belonged to Elizabeth. She lay under fresh sheets and a thick blanket. Her hair had been combed and pulled into a loose braid. Her face was still pale but clean. The newborn, wrapped in Aunt Bethy's wool shawl, was nursing eagerly at her mother's breast. It was a picture of such tenderness that Augustus felt a tightening in his chest. Aunt Bethy approached him, wiping her hands on an apron. "She was lucky, sir. No serious tears, just some bleeding that's already stopping. The girl is also well, considering the circumstances. Strong little fighter, this one." "And the mother?" Augustus asked quietly. "She'll be fine if she doesn't catch a fever. But she's very weak, too thin. Looks like she went days without eating properly. She'll need rest, good food, care." The housekeeper looked penetratingly at Augustus. "How long is she staying here?" It was a simple question but loaded with implications. Augustus had no answer. "At least until she fully recovers," he said finally. "I can't send her away in these conditions." Aunt Bethy nodded, satisfied. "I'll stay with her tonight. Josephine can take turns with me. The child will need to nurse every few hours and the mother can't be alone in case she has fever or bleeding." "Do whatever's necessary," said Augustus. He hesitated, then asked, "Did she say anything about how she came to be here?" "Not yet. She was too exhausted to talk. But tomorrow, when she feels better, we can ask." The old housekeeper lightly touched Augustus's arm. "You did a good thing today. You saved 2 lives. Mrs. Elizabeth would be proud." The words hit Augustus with unexpected force. He only nodded, not trusting his own voice, and left the room. The night passed slowly. Augustus tried to sleep but sleep wouldn't come. He kept imagining that young woman and her daughter a few doors down. Who was she? Where did she come from? Why was she alone on a stormy night, giving birth in an abandoned ruin? And why, of all people in the world, had it been he who found her? The first rays of dawn's sun were entering through the window cracks when Augustus finally gave up on sleeping. He got up, dressed, and went down to the dining room. To his surprise, he found Caleb already there having coffee. "Didn't sleep?" Augustus asked. "Slept a few hours in the corridor armchair," the overseer responded. "I wanted to stay nearby in case they needed help." Aunt Bethy said the young woman spent the night well, no fever, no complications. The girl nursed 3 times and is sleeping now. Augustus served himself coffee, the dark, strong liquid helping to push away the fatigue. It was Christmas Day. Normally the plantation's routine would be lighter, with workers having time off for their own modest celebrations. But essential work never stopped. Animals needed to be fed, cows milked, chickens tended. "Do the men know there's a sick young woman in the house?" Augustus asked. Caleb nodded yes. The news spread fast. "You know how it is. But I told everyone to keep their mouths shut and respect her privacy. I said she was a traveler you found in trouble. Well thought out." Augustus took another sip of coffee. "Caleb, you know all the families in the township. Have you ever seen this young woman before?" "She said her name is Mary." The overseer frowned thoughtfully. "Mary. The name's common, but her face seemed familiar to me. Let me think better when I see her again with daylight and rested. Sometimes we know people but don't recognize them when they're in very different situations." It was true. The Mary that Augustus had seen last night was unrecognizable from dirt, sweat, and suffering. Rested and clean, perhaps it would be easier to identify her. The day went by with a strange mixture of normality and tension. Augustus tried to keep busy with plantation administration, reviewing account books, planning the next tobacco harvest. But his thoughts constantly returned to the room upstairs. It was only in mid-afternoon that Aunt Bethy came looking for him in the library. "She's awake and feeling better," announced the housekeeper. "She managed to eat a bowl of chicken broth and is asking to speak with you." Augustus stood up immediately, smoothing his vest in a nervous gesture that wasn't characteristic of him. He climbed the stairs with Aunt Bethy, his heart beating faster than it should. Mary was sitting up in bed, supported by pillows. The afternoon sunlight entered through the window, illuminating her face. Augustus could see her clearly for the first time. She was beautiful, he realized with a start, not in the obvious and ornate way of society ladies, but with a natural and delicate beauty. She had large honey-brown eyes, fine features, soft lips. Her hair, now clean and loose over her shoulders, was light brown with golden reflections. The newborn slept in an improvised cradle beside the bed, a wicker basket lined with soft blankets. "Colonel Wakefield," said Mary, her voice still weak but clear. "I don't know how to thank you for what you did. You saved my life and my daughter's life." Augustus approached, maintaining a respectful distance. "I only did what any decent person would do. How are you feeling?" "Sore, but much better. And Aunt Bethy has been very kind to me." Mary looked at the housekeeper with genuine gratitude. "Everyone here has been." There was a moment of awkward silence. Finally, Augustus said, "Mary, I need to know some things. How did you come to be at that mill house? Why were you alone?" Mary's eyes filled with tears. She looked down, hands intertwined on the blanket. "It's a long story and not a very honorable one, sir." "I have time," said Augustus gently. "And I'm not here to judge you. But I need to understand the situation." Mary took a deep breath, gathering courage. "My father was a blacksmith in the township of Riverside, 2 days' journey from here. My mother died when I was 10. Father raised me alone, always was overprotective." She paused, wiping tears with the back of her hand. "Go on," Augustus encouraged. "A year ago a Portuguese merchant arrived in the township, Rafael Mendez. Young, handsome, with refined manners. He began courting me, saying beautiful words, making promises." Bitterness tinged her voice. "My father didn't like him. Said he didn't trust men who talked too much and worked too little. But I was foolish. I thought I was in love." Augustus felt a tightening in his chest, guessing where the story led. "Raphael said he wanted to marry me, that he'd take me to Lisbon, that I'd be a lady. I believed him. When I... She blushed deeply. "When I gave myself to him, I thought I was sealing our commitment. And he abandoned you when he discovered the baby," Augustus completed, his voice hard. Mary nodded, sobbing now. "Worse than that. He denied the child was his. Said I was a loose woman who'd probably lain with several men. He spread those lies throughout the township before leaving one dawn, taking merchandise he owed and money he'd borrowed." "And your father?" Aunt Bethy asked softly. "Died 3 months later. His heart. The doctor said it was natural, but I know it was heartbreak, shame." Mary cried freely now. "After father died, things got worse. People looked at me with contempt. Called me a fallen woman, a sinner. The priest condemned me from the pulpit. No one would give me work. How did you survive?" Augustus wanted to know. "Some took pity. The store owner let me sweep in exchange for food scraps. A widowed lady allowed me to wash clothes. But when my belly began to grow, even those charities ceased." She looked at her daughter sleeping in the cradle. "A week ago, the owner of the house where I lived, the house that was my father's, evicted me. Said he didn't want a harlot under his roof." Augustus felt rage boil within him. Rage at that Rafael Mendez who had seduced and abandoned an innocent young woman. Rage at the hypocrites of the township who condemned while calling themselves Christians. Rage at the casual cruelty of the world. "I walked for days," Mary continued, "sleeping in stables, barns, wherever I could find shelter. Eating what I found, fallen fruit, roots. Yesterday morning I felt the first pains. I desperately searched for a place to shelter. I found that old house. I thought at least it would be a roof. She sobbed. I thought I was going to die there. That my daughter would die before even being born. But you didn't die, Augustus said firmly. You're both alive. You're safe. Mary looked at him with an expression of despair mixed with hope. But for how long, sir? I know I can't abuse your hospitality. As soon as I can walk, I'll leave. I promise I won't bring you trouble. Go where? Aunt Bethy asked before Augustus could respond. Miss, you can barely sit up and you have a child who needs to be fed and cared for. Where do you think you can go? Mary had no answer. She lowered her head, defeated. Augustus looked at that young woman, barely more than a girl, really, couldn't be more than 18 years old. And at the innocent child in the cradle. He thought of Elizabeth, how she always defended the wronged. He thought of his son Peter Augustus, who hadn't had a chance to grow up. He thought of himself, living like a ghost in his own house. And he made a decision. You're staying, he said firmly. At least until you fully recover and the child is strong enough. That will take weeks, maybe months. I won't throw a mother and newborn baby onto the road. Mary's eyes widened. But, sir, what will people say? My presence here will stain your reputation. My reputation will survive, Augustus cut in. And anyone who has something to say can come talk to me directly. He softened his tone. Mary, you've been through terrible suffering. It wasn't your fault that you were deceived by a scoundrel. And this child is innocent of any sin. You're too kind, sir, she whispered. It's not kindness, it's decency. Augustus turned to Aunt Bethy. Provide everything she and the child need. Clothes, diapers, whatever's necessary. The housekeeper smiled, her eyes shining. It's already provided, sir. There's much stored in the trunks in Mrs. Elizabeth's room, things she set aside for, well, for when she had more children. Her voice choked for a moment. She would want them to be used. Augustus nodded, not trusting his own voice. He turned to leave, but Mary's voice stopped him. Colonel Wakefield, I haven't named her yet, my daughter. Mary looked at the child with infinite love. With your permission, I'd like to call her Anna Beatrice. Anna for the saint of the day and Beatrice because it means, she who brings happiness. Augustus looked at the sleeping girl. Anna Beatrice. It was a beautiful name, a name full of hope. It's a lovely name, he said. Welcome to Wakefield Manor, Anna Beatrice. And for the first time in 4 years, upon saying those words, Augustus Wakefield smiled. It was a small, hesitant smile, like a muscle long forgotten being used again. But it was genuine. Outside the room, Caleb waited in the corridor. When Augustus emerged, the overseer approached with a serious expression. I remembered where I saw the young woman before, he said quietly. It was in Riverside about 6 months ago. I was there buying tools. She was helping in a store, and I saw that Rafael Mendez she mentioned. He was a cocky type, full of airs. I remember thinking at the time that he didn't seem trustworthy. So her story is true, Augustus murmured. Everything indicates yes. And there's more. Caleb hesitated. Some travelers who passed through here months ago commented about a Portuguese man who pulled scams in Riverside. Took borrowed money, promised merchandise, sold things that weren't his, disappeared overnight. Augustus's jaw tightened. A complete scoundrel. Without a doubt, sir. And if the young woman came from Riverside walking while pregnant for 2 days, she must have gone through hell. Augustus looked out the corridor window. Outside, Christmas Day was ending. The sun was descending over the mountains, painting the sky in golden and pink tones. It was beautiful, peaceful. Caleb, I want you to spread the word among the workers. Mary and her daughter are under my protection. Anyone who disrespects them or spreads gossip will answer to me personally." The overseer smiled slightly. "Yes, sir. But I don't think there'll be a problem. The people here have good hearts. I've already seen several servants commenting about the poor girl and the little baby born on Christmas. They're even saying it's a sign from God." "Maybe it is," thought Augustus. "Or maybe it was just coincidence, or fate, or whatever other name you wanted to give to that impossible encounter in the storm." But as he returned to his chambers that night, Augustus realized something fundamental had changed inside him. The darkness that had enveloped him for 4 years hadn't disappeared. It probably never would completely. But there was a crack of light now, small, fragile, but real. 2 lives saved. A mother and child who, without his intervention, would be dead. It didn't bring Elizabeth and Peter Augustus back. Nothing ever could. But for the first time since he'd buried them, Augustus Wakefield felt that his own life perhaps still had purpose. And that, for now, was enough. The first 2 weeks of January 1856 brought subtle but profound changes to Wakefield Manor. Mary gradually recovered, gaining strength each day under Aunt Bethy's dedicated care. Little Anna Beatrice thrived, filling the house with her vigorous cries and occasional moments of silence when she slept satisfied after nursing. Augustus watched these transformations from a distance, maintaining respectful distance but unable to completely avoid encounters. Every morning, upon descending for coffee, he heard sounds coming from the upper floor, the child's cry, Mary's soft voice calming her, Aunt Bethy's shuffling slippers through the corridors. They were sounds of life in a house that had been silent for too long. On the 10th day after Christmas, Mary managed to descend the stairs for the first time. Augustus was in the library when Aunt Bethy knocked at the door. "Colonel Wakefield, the young woman Mary wants to thank you personally. She's feeling well enough to come down with my help." Augustus stood, instinctively smoothing his vest. "Bring her to the main hall. I'll have tea served." When he entered the hall minutes later, he found Mary seated in an upholstered chair near the window. The morning light illuminated her face and Augustus was surprised by the transformation. The young woman had gained some weight. Her cheeks were no longer hollow. She wore a simple but clean dress. He recognized it as one of Elizabeth's casual dresses, adjusted by Aunt Bethy. Her hair was pulled into a loose bun, some strands escaping to frame her face. "Colonel Wakefield," she said, trying to stand. "Please, don't get up," Augustus asked quickly, approaching. "You're still recovering?" Mary nodded, settling back. "I wanted to thank you personally for what you've been doing for me and Anna Beatrice. The kindness of everyone in this house has been," her voice failed, "emotional, has been more than I could have hoped for or deserved." "You do deserve it," Augustus said firmly, sitting in an opposite chair. "No woman deserves to go through what you went through." Josephine entered at that moment with a tray of tea and warm corn muffins. She served both with silent efficiency and withdrew. "Anna Beatrice as well?" Augustus asked, surprising himself with his genuine interest. Mary's face lit up. "She's strong, thank God. She eats well, sleeps reasonably. Aunt Bethy says she's a healthy child." She hesitated, then continued. "Would you like to see her? She's sleeping now, but..." Augustus felt something tighten in his chest. Since that first night, he deliberately avoided the room where mother and daughter stayed. Seeing a baby, hearing her cries, seemed a cruelty. It reminded him too much of Peter Augustus. But looking at Mary's hopeful face, he couldn't refuse. "Perhaps later," he said, taking a sip of tea to buy time. Mary nodded, seeming to understand more than he'd said. "Aunt Bethy told me about your wife and son, about the yellow fever. I'm deeply sorry, Colonel." "It was 4 years ago," Augustus responded automatically, the phrase he used whenever the subject arose, as if time made the loss easier. "Pain doesn't respect calendars," Mary said softly. I lost my father less than a year ago and I still expect to see him walk through the door sometimes. It was true. And there was something liberating about talking with someone who understood loss, who didn't offer empty platitudes about time healing all wounds. They talked for almost an hour. Mary spoke about her childhood in Riverside, about her blacksmith father who taught her to read using the family Bible, about her mother who died of pneumonia when she was a child. Augustus, in turn, found himself sharing memories of Elizabeth that he hadn't evoked in years, how she insisted on planting roses around the chapel, how she sang while supervising the making of sweets in the kitchen. It was Aunt Bethy who interrupted, coming to fetch Mary. The girl woke up and is hungry. And you need to rest more, miss. Can't tire yourself on the first day you come down. As she helped Mary stand, the housekeeper shot a significant look at Augustus, a look he preferred to ignore. The following days established a new routine. Mary began descending for meals when she felt up to it. Sometimes she dined with Augustus in the great dining room, quiet conversations about neutral topics. Other times, when Anna Beatrice was particularly fussy, she ate in her room. It was in the third week of January that the first important visitor arrived. Augustus was in the stables inspecting a horse when Caleb came running. "Sir, there's a carriage coming up the road. Looks like it's from Baron Ashford." Augustus frowned. Baron Thomas Ashford was owner of the neighboring plantation, an even larger property than Wakefield Manor. A widowed man in his early 50s, he'd been making insinuations in recent months about a possible union between families. Augustus had always declined politely. "Prepare the visiting room," Augustus instructed. "And ask Aunt Bethy to make sure Mary stays in her chambers. I don't want to embarrass her with indiscreet questions." Baron Ashford descended from his polished carriage with the help of a servant. He was a corpulent man with bushy mustaches and small eyes that always seemed to be calculating something. He dressed with exaggerated elegance for an informal country visit. "Colonel Wakefield," he greeted with a booming voice. "I hope I'm not disturbing on this fine day." "Not at all, Baron. Welcome." Augustus led him to the hall where Josephine had already served coffee and biscuits. After formal greetings and some minutes of conversation about the tobacco crop, the Baron got to the point. "Colonel, interesting rumors are circulating about your plantation," he said, his small eyes fixed on Augustus. "They say you're sheltering a young woman, a stranger." Augustus kept his expression neutral. "Rumors travel fast. They always do, especially when they involve a man of your position." The Baron took a sip of coffee. "It's not my intention to intrude, but as your neighbor and dare I say friend, I feel obliged to warn you. A single woman, unrelated, living under your roof, this can generate unpleasant talk." "Let them talk," Augustus responded coldly. "The young woman was dying when I found her. She'd just given birth alone in the middle of a storm. Any Christian would have done the same." "Ah yes, very noble." The Baron nodded, but his tone carried skepticism. "And how long do you intend for her to stay?" "Until she fully recovers and has conditions to continue on her way." "And if she doesn't want to continue on anyway?" The question was asked casually, but Augustus perceived the poisonous insinuation behind it. "Then that will be a decision I'll make when the time comes," Augustus said with finality that barely hid his irritation. The Baron studied him for a long moment, then changed tactics. "Colonel, you're still a young man, widowed for 4 years, without heirs. Have you thought about contracting a new marriage? I have a niece, Amelia, a girl of excellent family, educated in Charleston. 22 years old, virtuous, beautiful. It would be a very advantageous union for both families." "Ah, so that was it." The Baron wasn't concerned about Augustus's reputation. He was worried that Mary's presence might interfere with his plans to unite the plantations through marriage. "I appreciate your consideration, Baron, but I have no interest in marriage at the moment," Augustus responded firmly. "Because of this young woman?" The Baron didn't even try to hide the disdain in his voice. Augustus stood, signaling the visit had ended. My decision has nothing to do with Mary. It has to do with me and what I feel is appropriate for my life. The Baron stood too, clearly dissatisfied but knowing he'd gone too far. Very well, Colonel. But permit me one last piece of friendly advice. Be careful. Women in precarious situations sometimes have second intentions. It wouldn't be the first time a well-established man was deceived by tears and apparent fragility. It took all of Augustus's self-control not to physically expel the man from his house. Instead, he responded with an icy voice, "Thank you for the visit, Baron. Give my regards to your niece." After the carriage departed, Augustus stood on the porch, hands clasped behind his back, trying to control his anger. How dare that man come to his house and insinuate that Mary was some kind of schemer? "The Baron has always been a snake," said Caleb's voice behind him, full of venom and ready to strike. Augustus turned. "You heard? Part of it. Enough." The overseer spat on the ground, a rare gesture that demonstrated his contempt. "He's afraid you won't marry his niece. His lands are indebted. He needs that union." "How do you know that?" "Sir, I talk with workers from other plantations. Baron Ashford owes money to half the merchants in Richmond. He only hasn't gone bankrupt yet because he has land. But land without money to work it is just dirt." Augustus processed this information. It explained the Baron's insistence and also made him potentially dangerous. Desperate men did desperate things. "Stay alert," said Augustus. "And double the vigilance at the property borders. I don't put anything past the Baron when it comes to protecting his interests." That night during dinner, Augustus noticed Mary was particularly quiet. She moved food around on her plate without really eating. "Something wrong?" he asked. She looked up, hesitant. "Josephine told me about the Baron's visit, about the things he said." "I'm sorry, Colonel Wakefield. My presence here is hurting your reputation. People are talking, making assumptions. I don't care what people say. But you should care. What if this affects your business, your relations in society?" She took a deep breath. "Colonel Wakefield, perhaps it's better I leave. I'm already much better. I can find work somewhere, perhaps as a seamstress or—" "No," Augustus cut her off, surprising both of them with the vehemence of the word. "You're not ready to leave and I won't allow the venomous tongues of hypocrites to drive you from a safe place." Mary stared at him, her honey-brown eyes shining with emotion. "Why are you doing this? Why do you care what happens to me?" It was a simple question that demanded a complex answer. Augustus wasn't sure he could articulate all the reasons, because she reminded him there was still possible kindness in the world, because saving her life had given meaning to his, because for the first time in 4 years, the house didn't feel like a mausoleum. "Because it's the right thing to do," he said finally. It wasn't the complete answer, but it was the truth. Mary nodded slowly, seeming to accept. "Then, if I'm staying longer, I'd like to make myself useful. I can't simply live on charity. Is there something I can do, sewing perhaps, or helping in the kitchen?" Augustus thought for a moment. Then he remembered something Elizabeth had always desired but never completed. "Can you read and write?" he asked. "Yes, my father taught me. I read well." "Perfect. My late wife had started a small school for the children of tenant farmers and workers. After her death, the teacher who came from Richmond stopped appearing. The children have been without instruction since then." Augustus leaned forward. "If you're willing, you could take on that task. It would be real work, not charity, and would keep you occupied." Mary's face lit up for the first time since the conversation about the Baron. "I would love to work with children, to teach. It would be wonderful." "Then it's decided. When you're fully recovered, you can begin." That night, when Augustus went up to his chambers, he heard crying coming from Mary's room. Not Anna Beatrice's cry, but a different sound. He hesitated, then knocked softly on the door. "Mary, is everything all right?" The door opened. Mary had red eyes but was smiling. She held Anna Beatrice in her arms. "I'm sorry if I disturbed you." It's just that she smiled for the first time. A real smile, not just gas. And I thought how my father would have loved to see this. And the tears returned. Augustus stood there, not knowing what to do. Then, following an impulse, he extended his arms. "May I?" Mary blinked, surprised, but carefully passed the baby to him. Augustus held Anna Beatrice with hands that perfectly remembered how to hold a child even after 4 years. The girl stared at him with big, serious eyes. She had a tuft of dark hair, now more evident, and her cheeks had rounded out. And then it happened. Anna Beatrice smiled, a wide, toothless, absolutely radiant smile. Augustus felt something break inside him, not painfully, but like ice melting. Tears, the first he'd allowed since his son's funeral, filled his eyes. "She smiled," he murmured, his voice choked. "She really smiled." Mary gently touched his arm. "I think she knows you saved our lives." Augustus returned the baby to her, quickly wiping his eyes. "Sleep well, Mary. You too, little Anna." He returned to his room, closed the door, and for the first time in years, allowed himself to cry. He cried for Elizabeth, for Peter Augustus, for all the years of pain. But he also cried with relief, because something inside him that had been frozen was finally beginning to thaw. The days that followed brought more changes. The local vicar, Father Thomas, made a visit. He was an elderly man with kind eyes and white hair who had served the community for decades. "Colonel Wakefield," he said after initial greetings, "I came to verify the truth of rumors about a young mother in your house." Augustus tensed, preparing for more judgments. But the priest raised his hand. "I came not to judge, but to help. If there's a child who needs to be baptized and a mother who needs spiritual support, that's my duty." Augustus's surprise must have been visible, because the priest smiled. "Not all of us are like some of my more severe brothers, my son. Christ taught compassion, not condemnation." Father Thomas spent the afternoon with Mary, hearing her confession, offering absolution and comfort. He also agreed to baptize Anna Beatrice in the Manor's chapel in a simple ceremony. "I would like Colonel Wakefield to be godfather," Mary said timidly when the priest suggested the need for godparents. "If he accepts." Augustus, who was present in the conversation, felt the weight of the request. Being godfather meant responsibility, commitment. It meant permanently linking himself to that child. It would be an honor, he heard himself saying. The baptism took place on a sunny afternoon in February. Only the Manor's residents were present, Aunt Bethy, Caleb, some of the older workers. Father Thomas conducted the ceremony with dignity and tenderness. When Augustus held Anna Beatrice over the baptismal font, making the solemn promises to guide her in faith, he felt the weight of responsibility but also something more. He felt connected to that child in a way he hadn't expected. Anna Beatrice, as if understanding the solemnity of the moment, didn't cry. She just looked at Augustus with those big, serious eyes and smiled again. After the ceremony, during the small lunch that Aunt Bethy had prepared, Father Thomas pulled Augustus aside. "She's a good young woman, Colonel. She made a mistake out of naivety and love, not malice. And she's paying a high price for it." "I know, Father. And you?" The vicar studied him with perceptive eyes. "You're beginning to live again. I can see it. Elizabeth would be pleased." "Did you know her well?" Augustus said softly. "I did. And I know she wouldn't want to see you buried alive with her." The priest placed a hand on Augustus's shoulder. "The dead deserve our tears and our memory, but the living deserve our love and our presence. There's no betrayal in continuing to live." The words stayed with Augustus for days. There was no betrayal in continuing to live. It was simple but profound. February progressed. Mary fully recovered her strength and began working with the plantation's children. She organized classes 3 times a week in the main house hall, teaching letters and numbers to about 12 children between 5 and 12 years old. Augustus sometimes passed by the open door and saw Mary, Anna Beatrice, sleeping in an improvised cradle beside her, while she patiently taught a child to form letters. Her voice was soft but firm, and the children clearly adored her. "The house is different," Aunt Bethy commented one night while serving dinner. "It has life again." It was true. There were children's voices echoing through the corridors. There was Anna Beatrice's occasional cry. There were conversations during meals. Wakefield Manor was awakening from a long sleep. And Augustus, for the first time in 4 years, was beginning to awaken too. But not everything was roses. Rumors continued. Some families from local society began declining Augustus's invitations. Others made veiled comments at social gatherings. Baron Ashford, in particular, seemed determined to spread malicious gossip. It was Caleb who brought the most worrying news one morning in late February. "Sir, there's a man in the township asking questions about the young woman Mary. A Portuguese by accounts. He's asking if anyone saw a pregnant young woman, describing her exactly." Augustus felt his blood run cold. Rafael Mendez. It must be him. That's what I think too. What else do you know? That he's been staying at the township inn for 3 days. He's saying he's looking for the mother of his child, that she ran away from him and he wants to bring her back. Augustus clenched his fists. The scoundrel had the audacity to return. And worse, he was painting himself as the victim, as a concerned father. "Don't let Mary know yet," Augustus instructed. "I'll think about how to deal with this." But it was too late. When Augustus entered for dinner that night, he found Mary pale as chalk, trembling. "He's back," she whispered. One of the workers heard at the market. "Raphael is here. He found me." Dear listener, we will continue our exciting story in the next video. See you there.